I spent the night with a coworker, never again from Leopold. I was around 21 or 22 years old, living at home with my parents and younger brother, caught in one of those limbo phases of life, where you feel trapped between adolescence and adulthood. The house felt smaller every day, my parents' rules more suffocating, my brother's music more grating. Even the walls seemed to press inward at night, as if the very structure resented my continued presence. I was working a part-time job at a local warehouse, trying to save enough money to finally escape. The community college night classes were my only other reprieve, but they weren't enough. What I craved most was privacy, a space to breathe without someone's expectations crushing my lungs. My friends had scattered after high school, most moving away or developing schedules that made connection impossible. Work became my primary social outlet, though social might be too generous a term for the mindless interactions that filled those hours. The warehouse operated in a perpetual twilight of fluorescent lighting. My shifts bounced between early mornings that required 4 a.m. alarms and late afternoons that bled into midnight. The other employees were mostly guys my age, all of us moving boxes, loading trucks, and watching the clock with the same blank expressions. But there was one guy who didn't quite fit the mold. I'll call him Eric. Eric was a study in isolation. In the break room, he always occupied the farthest table, shoulders hunched over a barely touched sandwich or a can of off-brand soda. His eyes never met anyone else's. They stayed fixed on the table, the floor, the wall, anywhere but on another human face. If someone approached him with a friendly comment, his response was a barely audible mumble, his body language screaming discomfort. Some of the other guys had made him a target initially, throwing paper at his back or making comments just loud enough for him to hear. But Eric's complete non-reaction eventually made them lose interest. He became workplace furniture, present but ignored. I noticed him though. Something about that level of isolation felt familiar, a reflection of my own disconnection, just amplified to an extreme I hadn't reached. For weeks I observed him from a distance, making mental notes of his habits, the way he always used the same entrance, how he checked his phone exactly 3 times during each break, how he waited until the parking lot was nearly empty before leaving. Eventually, I began my approach, slowly, carefully, like you would with a wounded animal. A hey, when passing in the aisles. A comment about the weather while punching out. Nothing that demanded more than a nod or single-word response. After 2 weeks of these micro-interactions, I graduated to sitting at his table during breaks. Not directly across from him, that would be too much, but at the corner close enough for conversation, but far enough to maintain his comfort zone. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday. Eric was staring at his phone with such intensity that I thought something serious must have happened. His brow was furrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. I asked if everything was okay, expecting the usual dismissal. Instead, he looked up, actually looked at me, and spoke in more than a mumble. Phone's glitching again, 3rd time this month. It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in the wall. Over the following days, I found more opportunities to engage him, walking to the parking lot together, sharing a smoke break by the dumpsters, commenting on the supervisor's bizarre new haircut. With each interaction, Eric's responses grew incrementally longer, more detailed. He had a sense of humor that emerged in brief flashes, dry, unexpected observations that would catch me off guard and pull a genuine laugh from my chest. But there was an invisible boundary around him that remained impenetrable. Any suggestion to meet outside of work was immediately shut down with a vague excuse. Eventually, he admitted he lived far out, and town wasn't a place he liked to visit unnecessarily. One particularly bad afternoon shift. After listening to my parents' screaming match through the bathroom door that morning, and my brother's bass-heavy music vibrating my bedroom walls all night, I vented to Eric during our smoke break. I told him about the suffocation of home, about not having anywhere to escape to, about the impossibility of bringing anyone over. "You could come to my place," he said quietly, not looking at me. Then immediately added, "Probably not a good idea though." His tone had shifted, something dark creeping into his voice. But I was desperate for escape, any escape, and pushed past the warning in his words. "Why not? Is it really that far?" He didn't answer immediately, taking a long drag of his cigarette, eyes fixed on some distant point in the gray sky. "It's not just the distance," he finally said. For the next 2 days, he seemed to retreat back into his shell, responses shortening again, eye contact vanishing. I feared I'd somehow crossed a line and damaged our fragile friendship. Then a text arrived late Thursday night with an address and brief directions. The drive to Eric's place tested both my car's suspension and my commitment to social connection. The highway eventually gave way to a secluded paved road that stretched for miles without a single street light. Houses became increasingly rare until they disappeared entirely, leaving only dark fields and dense woods pressing against the road's edges. The turnoff came so suddenly, I nearly missed it. A narrow dirt path, marked by a weathered wooden sign that matched the road name Eric had texted. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness as I navigated the bumpy, winding trail. The trees grew denser, branches reaching over the path, like grasping fingers, scraping against my windows. The farther I drove, the more my phone's signal bars dropped until they disappeared completely. For nearly 2 miles, there was nothing but this claustrophobic tunnel of trees and darkness. My car's engine, the only sound breaking the unnatural silence. Then suddenly, the trees parted to reveal a clearing, and in its center, Eric's house, a small single-story structure that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. I had barely turned off the engine when the front door flew open, casting a yellow rectangle of light onto the porch. Eric's silhouette appeared, his arm waving frantically. "Run, hurry, man. Get in here." His voice carried a panic I'd never heard before. Raw, desperate. Without thinking, I launched myself from the car, sprinting across the uneven ground toward the house. My heart pounded in my ears, adrenaline flooding my system, every instinct screaming that something was pursuing me, though I dared not look back. I crossed the threshold into Eric's house, and he slammed the door behind me, throwing his weight against it as he engaged multiple locks, a deadbolt, a chain, and what looked like a custom bar that braced against the floor. Gasping for breath, I demanded, "What the hell was that about?" Eric leaned against the door, his face pale and sheened with sweat. His eyes kept darting to the windows, which I now noticed were covered by heavy blankets, nailed directly to the frames. "You got here earlier than I expected," he said, his voice hollow. I wasn't prepared. "Prepared for what?" I asked, my initial fear transforming into a mix of confusion and irritation. "Is someone after you or something?" He didn't answer, just pushed himself away from the door and moved to each window in turn, checking that the blankets were secure, that no gap existed between fabric and frame. The house smelled strange, a combination of burning herbs, mustiness, and something metallic I couldn't place. Let's just hang out, okay?" he finally said. "I've got some stuff we can smoke. Take the edge off." Eric's living room was a study in paranoia. Beyond the blanketed windows, I noticed symbols drawn above each doorway, not the pentagrams or occult symbols you'd expect from a horror movie, but intricate geometric patterns that seemed to have been burned into the wood. Bundles of dried plants hung from the ceiling in various corners, and a collection of stones formed a perfect circle in the center of the coffee table. Despite my growing unease, I accepted when he offered to smoke. The familiar ritual calmed my nerves, and for a while we managed something approaching normal conversation. We discussed old TV shows we both remembered, compared notes on terrible supervisors we'd had, and debated the merits of various video games. It almost felt like a regular hangout between friends, but Eric never fully relaxed.
His eyes continued their circuit around the room, pausing at each window and doorway. Occasionally he would freeze mid-sentence, head tilted, as if listening for something beyond human hearing. Each time, I found myself holding my breath, straining my own ears, but detecting nothing. By around 9, hunger drove us to the kitchen. Eric's refrigerator contained little beyond condiments and a 6-pack of beer. The freezer held a stack of microwave meals, from which we selected our dinner. As the ancient microwave hummed and rotated our food, I leaned against the counter, taking in the kitchen's details. Like the living room, it contained strange protective measures, salt lines along the windowsill, more of those geometric symbols above the doorway, and what appeared to be small mirrors, placed at odd angles around the room, each one oriented to reflect another. "Eric," I said carefully, "what exactly are you afraid of out here?" His back stiffened, but he didn't turn from the microwave. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me." He started to respond, but his words were drowned out by the most thunderous sound I had ever heard. A deafening series of impacts against the front door that shook the entire house.
Boom, boom, boom. 3 distinct knocks, each spaced exactly seconds apart, delivered with such force that a framed photograph fell from the wall and shattered on the floor. "Holy!" I started, but Eric clamped his hand over my mouth, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't make a sound," he whispered, his lips barely moving. We stood frozen in the kitchen, his hand still pressed against my mouth, both of us staring in the direction of the front door. The microwave beeped, causing me to flinch violently, but Eric didn't move to retrieve our food. After what felt like an eternity, I gently removed his hand. "Dude, you better get that," I whispered. "Sounds like someone really needs your attention." But Eric's face had drained of all color. In the harsh fluorescent kitchen light, he looked corpse-like, his skin waxy and gray. "You're not supposed to be here," he whispered, his voice trembling. Confusion and irritation flared within me. "If you didn't want company, why invite me?" He grabbed my arm with surprising strength, his fingers digging in. "No, you don't understand. If you go out there before sunrise, something very, very bad will happen. You can't leave. Not now." The absolute conviction in his voice sent ice water cascading down my spine. This wasn't social anxiety or paranoia. This was genuine, bone-deep terror. Before I could respond, the knocks came again, somehow even louder than before. Boom, boom, boom. The house shuddered. Dust fell from the ceiling. A glass tumbled from a shelf and shattered on the tile. Eric pressed a finger to his lips, then reached over to flip off the kitchen light. Darkness enveloped us, broken only by the faint green glow of the microwave display. He motioned for me to follow him, and we crept through the house, avoiding the windows, moving in a crouch, as if whatever was outside might be able to sense our height. We reached his bedroom, which was even more heavily fortified than the rest of the house. The window was not just covered with a blanket, but boarded up from the inside. The walls were lined with shelves, holding dozens of candles, bottles of unclear substances, and books with worn spines and faded titles. Strange symbols were painted directly onto the ceiling, in what looked like dark red paint. At least, I hoped it was paint. "We need to wait it out," Eric whispered, sinking onto the edge of his bed. "It'll be gone by morning." "What will be gone?" I demanded, though I kept my voice low. "What the hell is out there?" He shook his head, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of defeat. "You wouldn't believe me. Try me," I insisted again. Eric stared at the floor for a long moment, then sighed. "It started about 2 years ago. I was driving home late one night, and I hit something on the road." The unexpected turn in his story caught me off guard. "Like an animal." "I thought so at first," he continued, his voice taking on a distant quality. "It was small, darting across the road. I couldn't stop in time. I felt the impact, but when I got out to check, there was nothing there. No blood, no body. Just this sound like someone laughing, but all wrong. He rubbed his face, the stubble on his chin, making a scratching sound in the quiet room. I thought I was just tired, imagining things. But when I got home, it was waiting for me. Standing in my yard, just watching. What was? I pressed. I don't know what to call it, he said. It looks almost human, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, and its face. He swallowed hard. Its smile is too wide. On cue, the knocking came again. 3 perfect impacts that seemed to make the very air vibrate. It comes every night, Eric whispered, after the sound faded. Always at the same times, every hour, on the hour, from sunset to sunrise. It never misses. The clinical precision of the schedule somehow made it more terrifying than if it had been random. This wasn't just a haunting, it was methodical, patient, ritualistic. Have you tried? I don't know. Calling someone? Moving? I asked, knowing how inadequate these suggestions were, even as I voiced them. A bitter laugh escaped him. Who would I call? The police? Hello, officer. There's a supernatural entity knocking on my door. Could you send someone over? He gestured vaguely at the room. It found me the first time. It would find me again. Anyway, I can't afford to move. This place was my grandparents'. It's all I have. As he spoke, I noticed something on his forearm. A scar or tattoo peeking out from beneath his sleeve. When he shifted, I caught a better glimpse. It was another symbol, similar to those painted around the house, but this one looked like it had been carved directly into his skin. What's that? I asked, pointing. He quickly pulled his sleeve down. Protection. At least, that's what the woman in town said. What woman? Some old lady who runs an herb shop. After the 3rd month of this visitation, I got desperate. Started looking into folklore, local legends, anything that might explain what was happening. She said this entity feeds on fear and isolation, that it chooses one victim at a time and wears them down until they can't take it anymore. The implication hung heavy in the air between us. And then? I finally asked. Eric shrugged, but the gesture wasn't casual. It was resigned. People disappear around here sometimes. Go missing. The authorities blame it on the terrain, on people getting lost in the woods, or falling into old mining shafts. The old lady had a different theory. Hours passed in that room, marked by the rhythmic knocking that came exactly on the hour, every hour. Eric had clearly developed a routine for these nights. He knew precisely when to cover his ears, when it was safe to whisper, when silence was mandatory. Between visitations, he told me more about his research into what might be plaguing him. Theories ranging from cryptids to demons, to interdimensional beings. None of it brought him any closer to a solution. Around 3 a.m., Eric finally succumbed to exhaustion, his body slumping against the headboard, in uneasy sleep. I remained wide awake, my nerves too frayed for rest, my mind cycling through everything he had told me, trying to separate paranoia from possibility. The knocking came again at 3 a.m., right on schedule. Eric didn't even stir. His body had adapted to the terror, finding sleep despite the impossibility of peace. As the sound faded, a terrible curiosity began to grow within me. What exactly was out there? Was it truly as Eric described, or was this an elaborate hoax? Perhaps some local playing a cruel joke, or even a wild animal that had developed a strange behavioral pattern. The rational part of my brain insisted there must be a logical explanation, while a deeper, more primal part warned me to stay put, to trust in Eric's fear. Curiosity won. With Eric asleep, I carefully rose from my position on the floor, stepping over the creakiest boards I had identified earlier. The house was pitch black, but my eyes had adjusted enough to make out shapes and obstacles. Moving with painstaking slowness, I made my way back to the living room, toward the front window nearest the door. My heart pounded so loudly, I was certain it would wake Eric,
or alert whatever might be outside. Sweat beaded on my forehead, despite the chill in the air. As I reached the window, I paused, listening intently for any sound beyond my own breathing. Nothing. The heavy blanket covering the window was secured with nails along the top, but the bottom edge was loose, allowing me to carefully lift it just enough to peer out. The night beyond the glass was a void, moonlight, obscured by clouds that had rolled in since my arrival. Our cars sat like hulking shadows in the yard, but otherwise, the clearing appeared empty. I waited for my eyes to adjust further, scanning the tree line that encircled the property. Still nothing. Just as I was about to let the blanket fall back into place, convinced I had given in to Eric's paranoia, the clouds shifted. Moonlight spilled across the yard, in a sudden silver flood, illuminating everything in stark relief. And there it was, standing perfectly still beside my car. The figure was tall, impossibly so. Its proportions stretched beyond human limits. Its limbs hung at awkward angles, too long for its torso, fingers extending like pale twigs from hands that nearly reached its knees. It wore what might have once been clothing, now reduced to tattered scraps that fluttered slightly in the breeze. But it was the face that froze the blood in my veins. Bone white in the moonlight, stretched into a parody of human features. The eyes were deep, empty sockets, yet somehow I knew they were fixed directly on me. And the mouth, dear God, the mouth was spread in a grin that literally reached from ear to ear, filled with teeth too numerous and too sharp for any natural creature. As if sensing my gaze, it tilted its head at an angle that would snap a human neck. Then, with a movement too fluid to be natural, it began to approach the house. Its gait, a jerking, insect-like scuttle that covered ground with terrifying speed. I stumbled backward, letting the blanket fall. A scream built in my throat, but terror strangled it into a strangled whimper. I tripped over something in the darkness, a chair or table, and crashed to the floor with enough noise to wake the dead. From the bedroom came Eric's panicked voice. "What are you doing?" But before I could answer, a new sound filled the house, a dry, rasping laugh that seemed to come from directly outside the door, inches away from where I lay frozen on the floor. I scrambled to my feet and ran blindly through the darkness, colliding with walls and furniture in my desperation to reach the bedroom. When I finally burst through the doorway, Eric was already standing, his face a mask of resigned horror. "You looked," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm sorry," I gasped, slamming the door behind me. I didn't believe. I thought maybe. Words failed me, as the image of that elongated face, with its impossible smile burned behind my eyelids. "It knows you're here now," Eric whispered. "It's never seen anyone else here before." "What does that mean?" I demanded, panic raising my voice, despite the danger. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know." For the rest of the night, we huddled in that room, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. The knocking continued its hourly schedule, but now it was accompanied by that terrible laughter between impacts. Occasionally, something would scratch at the walls, a slow, deliberate sound that traced the perimeter of the house, as if searching for a way in. When the first gray light of dawn finally seeped through the cracks in the boarded window, relief washed over me, with such intensity that my knees nearly buckled. Eric's posture relaxed marginally, as well, though the haunted look never left his eyes. "It's gone," he confirmed, after a few minutes of silence. "Until tonight, I didn't need to be told twice." Gathering my belongings with shaking hands, I prepared to leave, my mind already calculating the fastest route back to the highway, back to populated areas, with street lights and cell service. Eric walked me to the door, but made no move to step outside himself. As I stood on the threshold, key fob clutched in my sweating palm, I turned back to him. He looked smaller somehow, diminished in the weak morning light. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his skin had a grayish tinge that spoke of months, perhaps years, of sleepless nights, and constant terror. "You should leave this place," I said, knowing even as I spoke how empty the advice was. A sad smile touched his lips. "Where would I go? What would I do? It found me once, it would find me again." I had no answer for that. We stood in awkward silence for a moment, before I finally nodded, and turned toward my car. "Take care of yourself," he called after me, his voice carrying a finality that suggested he knew we would never see each other again. I glanced back one last time, as I reached my car. Eric stood framed in the doorway, a solitary figure against the dim interior of the house. He raised a hand in farewell, then quickly retreated inside. The sound of multiple locks, engaging, carried clearly in the morning stillness. The drive back felt surreal, the horrors of the night fading with each mile I put between myself and that isolated clearing. By the time I reached the highway, with its comforting flow of normal traffic and roadside diners, I had almost convinced myself that exhaustion and Eric's convincing fear had caused me to hallucinate what I'd seen through the window. Almost, but not quite. When I arrived at work the next day, Eric's absence wasn't immediately alarming. Perhaps he'd called in sick, needing rest after our ordeal. But as days stretched into a week with no sign of him, concern began to gnaw at me. I tried calling his number repeatedly, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. After 10 days, management announced that Eric had quit without notice. His replacement arrived the following Monday, a cheerful college student who filled Eric's quiet corner of the warehouse with mindless chatter. Sometimes, when driving home late at night, I find myself scanning the roadside with heightened alertness, watchful for any elongated figure that might dart into my headlights. I avoid rural routes and unlit stretches of highway, preferring the safety of street lamps and traffic. And on particularly dark nights, when the wind rattles my bedroom window with rhythmic persistence, I lie awake counting the sounds, terrified that I might identify a pattern of 3. Eric, if you're out there listening to this, I still consider you a friend, and I hope to hear from you one day. I hope you're doing okay. But most of all, I hope that whatever waited outside your door each night has not found a new home outside of mine.
Our haunted post office from the deliverer. I work at our small town's post office, have done for about 7 years now. I'm 32, married, father of 2 boys. Until recently, I was the type who rolled my eyes at ghost stories and supernatural claims. To me, they were fabrications told by attention seekers or the overly imaginative. But now I've changed my mind. Because over the past few months, I've experienced things at work that defy logical explanation, phenomena I would dismiss as nonsense if someone else reported them, but which I witnessed with my own eyes and ears. Our post office is situated at the edge of town, a brick building from the 1920s or 30s that looks like it hasn't been properly maintained since it was built. The windows sit high on the walls, small rectangles that admit light but offer no view of the outside world. Inside, the paint is a dingy off-white, water stains mapping the ceiling like yellow continents on a white sea. The floor tiles are cracked in places, worn smooth in others from decades of foot traffic. We run a small operation, just me, 2 other clerks named Ray and Dina, and our postmaster, Mrs. Harlow, who rarely emerges from her office. Our hours are limited compared to city facilities, weekdays from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., with a half day on Saturdays. Being in such a small team means we often cover for each other, and it's not unusual for one of us to handle closing duties alone when someone needs to leave early. Those solitary closing shifts were when the strangeness began. Sound effect, clock ticking, distant door closing. The first incident occurred just after the holiday rush had subsided. The office had returned to its normal quiet rhythm, with customers trickling in sporadically, rather than standing in the out-the-door lines of December. It was nearly 4 p.m. on a Tuesday, when Ray asked if I could close alone, because he needed to pick up his daughter from school. It wasn't an imposition. Closing solo usually just meant locking up, finalizing the day's records, and ensuring the mail was sorted for morning pickup, a process that typically took about 20 minutes. After the last customer left, I locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. The sudden absence of voices made the building seem larger, emptier. The only sounds were the constant hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional metallic ping from the radiators. I followed my usual closing routine, counting the drawer, filing the day's receipts, and making a final sweep through the back to ensure all exterior doors were secure. After checking that the loading dock door was properly locked, I turned off the lights in the sorting area. That's when I first heard it. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the public lobby near the P.O. boxes. My initial thought was that a customer had somehow slipped in before I locked the door, or perhaps Ray had forgotten something and returned. But the blinds were already down on the front windows, which I only lowered after locking up. Still, I went to check. The lobby was empty, the front door securely locked. I stood perfectly still, listening, and heard the footsteps again, this time behind me, in the area I had just left. They were deliberate and measured, the sound of hard-soled shoes on linoleum. I spun around, heart suddenly racing, but saw nothing, just rows of P.O. boxes, and the shadowy corridor leading back to the sorting room. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly unsteady. "Is someone there?" Silence answered me. I took a deep breath, trying to rationalize. It was an old building. Pipes contracted as they cooled. The foundation settled. The wind created pressure changes that made strange noises. These were normal explanations for abnormal sounds. But as I stood there, straining my ears in the silence, I couldn't shake the overwhelming sensation that I was not alone. That someone or something was watching me from just beyond my peripheral vision. The feeling followed me as I quickly finished closing procedures and hurried to my car. That night, lying in bed next to my sleeping wife, I kept replaying the sound of those footsteps in my mind. They hadn't echoed like normal footfalls on hard flooring. They'd sounded oddly muffled, as if whoever or whatever made them was walking through a different layer of reality that only partially intersected with our own. The second incident occurred about 2 weeks later, and it was significantly more disturbing. We'd been experiencing electrical issues throughout the building, lights flickering, phones cutting out, computers rebooting without warning. Mrs. Harlow finally arranged for an electrician to inspect the fuse box and wiring. The appointment was scheduled for late afternoon, and I volunteered to stay and lock up after he finished. The electrician completed his work around 5 p.m., explaining that the building's outdated wiring was being taxed by our modern equipment. He suggested a complete rewiring, but acknowledged that the Postal Service was unlikely to approve such an expensive renovation for our small branch. After he left, I decided to stay for another half hour to get ahead on sorting parcels for the next day's deliveries. The building was silent, save for the rustling of packaging, as I scanned and organized boxes on the sorting table. I was deep in concentration when the overhead light began to flicker. Initially, I dismissed it as more electrical problems, but after about 30 seconds, I noticed something unnerving. The flickering followed a pattern. Darkness for 1 second, 2 quick flashes, then darkness again. Over and over, with mathematical precision. Discomfort prickled along my spine as I watched this unnatural rhythm continue. I set down the package in my hands and walked toward the breaker panel, wondering if the electrician had left something unfinished. Before I reached it, a thunderous crash erupted behind me. I whirled around to find an entire shelf of sorting bins toppled onto the floor. Mail scattered across the linoleum. These weren't lightweight plastic containers. They were heavy-duty industrial sorters filled with parcels and letters, secured to the wall with metal brackets. I approached cautiously, examining the brackets, which remained firmly attached to the wall. It looked as if the entire unit
had been yanked forward with enormous force. The bins pulled away from their supports rather than the supports failing. As I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, every light in the building went out simultaneously. Darkness enveloped me, so complete that for a moment I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. The only illumination came from the faint red glow of the exit signs, casting bloody shadows across the walls and floor. My breath caught in my throat as a surge of primal fear washed through me. I fumbled for my phone, activating the flashlight function with trembling fingers. The beam cut through the darkness, creating more shadows than it eliminated. As I swept the light across the room, searching for a path to the breaker panel, I caught a glimpse of movement to my left, something dark and substantial disappearing behind a row of mail carts. It moved with purpose, not like a shadow cast by my light, but independently, with its own momentum and direction. Before I could process what I'd seen, an icy current of air swept past me, raising goosebumps along my arms, despite the heavy sweater I wore. There was no ventilation running, no open windows, no source for such a localized cold spot, yet it passed over me, like the exhale of something immense and frigid. I abandoned all thoughts of resetting the breaker. In that moment, self-preservation overrode both curiosity and duty. I navigated through the darkness to the side exit, slammed the door behind me, and locked it with hands that shook so badly I nearly dropped the keys. The drive home was a blur, my mind cycling through rational explanations and finding none that fit. I told my wife I wasn't feeling well when she commented on my pallor and trembling hands. That night, I dreamt of shadowy figures sorting mail with elongated fingers, their faces hidden in darkness. The third incident, the one that obliterated any remaining skepticism, happened just last week, and it wasn't something I experienced alone. It was a Friday evening, and my coworker Dina had volunteered to help me complete a bulk mailing for the town's Chamber of Commerce. Hundreds of identical newsletters that needed sorting by postal route. We had stayed after closing, expecting to finish within an hour or so. The atmosphere was pleasant as we worked side by side at the sorting table, chatting about our families and weekend plans. Dina described her daughter's upcoming dance recital, while I shared stories about my son's baseball games. The building felt normal. No flickering lights, no unexplained noises, just the comfortable rhythm of work and conversation. As Dina was mid-sentence, describing the elaborate costume her daughter would wear, she suddenly froze. The smile dropped from her face, replaced by an expression of such profound horror that I felt my own blood run cold before I even knew what she was seeing. Her eyes were fixed on a point over my shoulder, her mouth open in a silent scream. I turned, following her gaze to the doorway leading to the loading dock. Standing there was a figure so utterly wrong that my mind initially refused to process it. It had the general shape of a human, head, torso, limbs, but stretched and distorted beyond natural proportions. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its body impossibly thin, as if someone had taken a person and pulled them like taffy. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't its height or thinness. It was its utter absence of light. It wasn't a person wearing black. It was a void in human form, a three-dimensional shadow that seemed to absorb the light around it. Where a face should have been, there was only deeper darkness, though I had the overwhelming sensation that it was looking directly at us, studying us. Dina's scream shattered the frozen moment. The figure darted sideways with unnatural speed, disappearing behind stacked mail containers. We bolted for the front door, all thoughts of finishing our work abandoned. As Dina fumbled with her keys, trying to unlock the door with shaking hands, a deep, guttural growl emanated from the sorting room behind us, a sound no human throat could produce, filled with such malevolence that I physically felt ill. When we finally burst outside into the twilight, the cool evening air felt like salvation against my clammy skin. We ran to our respective cars, without discussion, engines roaring to life, almost simultaneously, as we fled the parking lot. The next morning, we were summoned to Mrs. Harlow's office to explain why we had left the building unlocked overnight. A serious security violation. Side by side, we described what we had witnessed. Mrs. Harlow's expression remained impassive, but I noticed her fingers whitening as she gripped her pen with increasing force. When we finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then, instead of the reprimand I expected, she opened her desk drawer and removed a small silver cross on a chain. "Keep this with you," she said, handing it to Dina, whose face had remained ashen since the previous night. From another drawer, she produced a small bottle of what looked like water and put a few drops of this at each doorway before you leave today. She offered no further explanation, and we asked for none. The unspoken acknowledgement that our postmaster, the most pragmatic, no-nonsense person I knew, believed our story, was more terrifying than any formal validation. Dina submitted her 2 weeks' notice that afternoon, but never returned to work. She called me the following Sunday, voice quavering, to say she couldn't set foot in that building again, not even to collect her final paycheck. I understood completely. I'm still at the post office, anchored by financial necessity. My family depends on my income and benefits, a reality that outweighs even the bone-deep dread I feel each morning as I unlock those doors. But I've made adjustments to my routine. I carry a small silver cross in my pocket now, similar to the one Mrs. Harlow gave Dina. I say a quiet prayer before entering the building each morning, and another before locking up each night. I never stay alone after hours, and I've started carrying a small vial of blessed water, applying drops to the thresholds, as Mrs. Harlow suggested. Most of my coworkers remain oblivious or skeptical. Ray laughed when I tried to warn him, suggesting the building simply had rats in the walls or foundation issues causing strange noises. Only Mrs. Harlow seems to understand, though she refuses to discuss it directly. Once, when I arrived early and found her alone in the building, I caught her placing small pouches of herbs in the corners of rooms. Our eyes met, but neither of us acknowledged what she was doing. The incidents have become less dramatic, but more pervasive. Small occurrences that might be dismissed individually, but form a pattern of wrongness when taken together. Cold spots materialize and dissipate throughout the day, especially near the loading dock. The scent of sulfur occasionally wafts through the back room without any apparent source. Items disappear from where they were placed, only to reappear elsewhere. And sometimes, when sorting mail alone, I hear my name whispered from empty corners of the room. I've researched the building's history, hoping to find some explanation. The land where the post office stands was once part of a larger property, owned by a family named Merritt in the late 1800s. Local records are sparse, but newspaper archives mention a series of unexplained deaths in the family over a single winter. 4 children, and both parents, none with clear cause. The property remained vacant for decades afterward, with locals claiming it was cursed. When the post office was built in 1928, workers reportedly unearthed human remains during excavation, bones that weren't part of any formal burial, but had been hastily interred beneath what became our loading dock. The official explanation was that they were Native American remains, which were supposedly relocated to a proper burial ground. But some of the older residents tell a different story, that the bones belonged to the Merritt children, and that they were simply reburied beneath the new concrete foundation. I don't know which version is true. All I know is that something walks the corridors of our small-town post office after hours. Something that doesn't belong in this world, but has found a way to reach through anyway. If you're hearing this and remain skeptical, I understand. I was once like you, but after witnessing a shelf tear itself from the wall, and seeing that pitch black figure with my own eyes. I've accepted that there are forces at work in this world beyond our understanding. Forces that sometimes carry malevolence in their wake. And if you ever find yourself alone in an old building as the sun sets, and you hear footsteps when no one is there, or feel a sudden chill where there should be warmth, don't dismiss it. Don't rationalize it away. Because acknowledging the presence is the first step in protecting yourself from it. I know that now.
Something in the parking lot with me from Davy M. I work at a local Walmart in the electronics department. Although, like most retail jobs, I end up doing everything from restocking shelves to covering registers when they're short-staffed. It's just a stepping stone until I finish my degree at the community college. Nothing glamorous, but it pays the bills. My shift usually runs from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., sometimes later if we're busy or short-staffed. The store is in a semi-rural area, surrounded by more parking lot than it needs, with fields and a small wooded area beyond. This happened in mid-December during a particularly brutal cold snap. We'd had heavy snowfall that morning, the kind that starts as huge, lazy flakes, and then intensifies into a white wall that obscures everything beyond a few feet. By evening, the plows had cleared the main roads, but our parking lot was still a mess of piled snow and icy patches, despite the half-hearted efforts of our maintenance crew. My scheduled break came late that night, around 8 p.m. The store was eerily quiet for a Walmart. The weather had scared away all but the most determined shoppers. Looking through the front windows, I could see the parking lot was nearly empty. Just a few scattered cars dusted with fresh snow, their shapes softened into white mounds under the blue-white glow of the lot lights. For my break, I decided to escape to my car rather than the stuffy break room. 30 minutes of solitude in my own space sounded infinitely more appealing than listening to my manager complain about seasonal hiring woes. I bought some chips and a soda from the vending machine and headed out into the cold. The moment I stepped outside, my breath crystallized in front of my face. The temperature had plummeted after sunset, turning the earlier slush into treacherous ice. The wind had died down completely, creating an unnatural stillness. No cars passing on the nearby highway, no birds, no distant voices, just absolute silence broken only by the crunch of my boots through the fresh layer of snow. Our employee parking section was about 4 rows back from the entrance, close enough to be convenient but far enough that customers wouldn't take the spots. My car, an older Honda Civic with peeling paint and over 100,000 miles on the odometer, was one of maybe 15 vehicles scattered across a lot designed for hundreds. As I trudged through the snow, I found myself increasingly aware of the vast emptiness surrounding me. The parking lot lights created pools of harsh illumination, but between them lay stretches of deeper darkness. The snow reflected the light in strange ways, creating misleading shadows and odd visual distortions. I reached my car, brushed some snow from the door handle, and slipped inside. The interior was freezing, but it still felt like sanctuary, a private space insulated from work demands and customer interactions. I started the engine to get the heater running, opened my soda with a satisfying hiss, and settled in to mindlessly scroll through my phone. About 10 minutes into my break, I heard it, a light tapping sound from the passenger side of the car. It wasn't loud, just a gentle tap 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 against the metal, almost tentative. I glanced up from my phone, scanning the area visible through the windows. Nothing moved in the surrounding parking lot. The snow continued to fall lazily, no wind to drive it. Probably just ice falling from somewhere, I muttered to myself, returning to my phone. But the sound nagged at me. There were no trees nearby, no overhangs where accumulated snow or ice might drop, and the tapping had seemed too deliberate, too rhythmic to be random. I had almost managed to dismiss it when the sound came again, this time on the driver's side door, right beside my head. Tap, tap, tap. 3 distinct knocks, light but unmistakable. I jumped, heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. Someone was outside my car. Cautiously, I lowered the window a fraction of an inch and peered out. The parking lot remained empty. I checked my side mirror, expecting to see a coworker who'd followed me out, perhaps needing to borrow something, or deliver a message from management. Nothing, just swirling snow, and the distant glow of the store entrance. A nervous laugh escaped me, short and hollow in the confined space. Had I imagined it? Was I so desperate for my break to remain undisturbed, that my mind had conjured a threat where none existed? I decided to investigate. Zipping my coat up to my chin, I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the fresh snow. I immediately noticed something strange. The only footprints visible were my own, from when I'd walked to the car originally. There were no new tracks approaching or circling the vehicle, just pristine, undisturbed snow spanning in all directions. Puzzled, I crouched down to look beneath the car, wondering if perhaps a small animal had sought shelter from the cold. But the space under the chassis was empty, save for a few icicles hanging from the undercarriage. I completed a full circuit around the vehicle, checking every side, even the roof. Nothing unusual presented itself. No fallen ice, no tree branches, no evidence of anything that could explain the tapping. Unsettled but trying to rationalize, I returned to the driver's seat, closed the door firmly, and locked it with a reassuring click. Just the cold making the metal contract, I told myself. Or maybe the engine ticking, as it warms up. I turned the heat higher, and returned to my phone, attempting to lose myself in social media for the remaining minutes of my break. Perhaps 3 or 4 minutes passed in silence, before it happened again. Tap tap tap, this time from the trunk area. My entire body tensed. There was no mistaking it now. Something was systematically moving around my car, tapping at different locations. Anger briefly overrode my unease. If this was a prank by a coworker, it wasn't funny. I yanked the keys from the ignition and burst out of the car, determined to catch whoever was messing with me. "All right, very funny," I called out, my voice sounding thin and strained in the vast emptiness of the parking lot. "You can come out now." No response, not even an echo. I stalked around to the trunk, expecting to find footprints this time, some evidence of the prankster's retreat. The snow remained undisturbed, a perfect blanket of white, surrounding my car. In every direction, a cold that had nothing to do with the December air settled in my stomach. This wasn't possible. Something had touched my car. I had heard it clearly, but had somehow done so without leaving any trace in the snow. Moving more cautiously now, I bent down to check beneath the vehicle again. The space appeared different than it had minutes before. There was now a dark spot near the center of the undercarriage, a shadow where none had been during my previous inspection. I crouched lower, trying to identify what was causing it. The shadow seemed oddly shaped, not corresponding to any part of the car's mechanics that I could recognize. As I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, the shadow moved. There is no adequate way to describe the horror of watching a shadow move independently, with purpose and awareness, when there is nothing present to cast it. It shifted slightly, contracting, and then expanding, and then, God help me, 2 points of light appeared within it, like eyes opening. I fell backward into the snow, a strangled sound escaping my throat. The eyes, if that's what they were, remained fixed on me, unblinking, and utterly alien. They emitted no light of their own, but seemed to reflect the parking lot lamps with a dull reddish glint. Scrambling to my feet, I lunged for the driver's side door, wrenched it open, and threw myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the keys twice before managing to insert them into the ignition. I sat there, breathing hard, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Was I hallucinating from stress or lack of sleep? Was there an actual person somehow concealed beneath my car? None of these explanations felt adequate, yet my rational mind desperately searched for one. Anything to avoid facing the growing certainty that whatever was under my car was not something that should exist in our world. I realized with a sickening lurch that I should be able to see beneath the car from my current position, at least partially, through the gap under the dashboard. I could simply lean down and check if the shadow was still there, but I couldn't make myself look. Fear paralyzed me, the primitive part of my brain,
screaming that maintaining ignorance, even briefly, was safer than confirming what might be there. Then I heard it, a long, drawn-out exhalation, coming from directly behind me. A breath that didn't belong to me, couldn't belong to me, because I was holding my own breath in terror. The sound was deliberate, almost performative, as if whatever made it wanted to ensure I knew it was there. Inside the car with me, my muscles locked. Every instinct warned against turning around, against acknowledging the presence. My eyes remained fixed on the windshield, though I registered nothing beyond my own reflection. Pale face, wide eyes, paralyzed with fear. Another breath from the back seat, slower this time, raspier. Fight or flight finally kicked in, tilting decisively toward flight. I counted to 3 in my head, then shoved the door open, and lunged out of the car. In a single desperate movement, I slammed the door behind me, and ran for the store entrance, not daring to look back even once. I nearly collided with an elderly shopper, as I burst through the automatic doors, mumbling an apology, as I stumbled past her. The fluorescent lights and normal bustle of the store, however subdued by the weather, felt like an embrace of sanity, after what I'd experienced in the parking lot. Clocking back in, I was confronted by my supervisor Laura, who frowned at her watch, and informed me I was nearly 15 minutes late, returning from break. I tried to explain that something strange had happened in the parking lot, but the moment I began describing the tapping sounds and the shadow, her expression shifted from annoyance to skepticism. "If you need more break time, just say so," she said, cutting me off. "Don't make up stories about parking lot ghosts." She pointed me toward the electronics department, adding that I'd receive a write-up for tardiness. For the remainder of my shift, I moved through the store in a daze, mechanically answering customer questions, while my mind repeatedly cycled through what I'd experienced. By closing time at 10:30 p.m., I had almost convinced myself that stress and exhaustion had caused me to overreact to ordinary stimuli, a position significantly more comfortable than the alternatives. But as the last customers filed out, and we began shutdown procedures, the prospect of returning to my car loomed like a physical weight. I delayed as long as possible, volunteering for additional closing tasks, and meticulously straightening merchandise displays that could have waited until morning. Eventually, the closing manager noticed my stalling and firmly suggested it was time for me to leave, pointing out that they couldn't lock up until all employees had exited the building. The walk across the parking lot was the longest of my life. Each step through the freshly fallen snow felt like moving through molasses, my body resisting, even as my mind tried to rationalize away my fear. The lot was even emptier now, just a few cars belonging to the closing staff, scattered across the vast expanse of white. My Civic sat exactly where I'd left it, now covered with a fresh layer of snow that had filled in my earlier footprints. I approached cautiously, circling the vehicle at a distance, looking for any signs of disturbance. Nothing seemed amiss. No unusual shadows beneath the car. No footprints, other than my own fresh ones. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and hesitated, gathering courage. In one swift motion, I yanked the door open and flipped on the interior light. The back seat was empty. No shadowy figure, no creature, nothing out of the ordinary. Just my gym bag and an old sweater I'd forgotten to bring inside. Relief flooded through me, followed quickly by embarrassment. Had I truly worked myself into such a state over nothing? The tapping could easily have been ice, or snow falling onto the car, and the shadow beneath the vehicle was probably just an oil stain I hadn't noticed initially. As for the breathing, well, in my panicked state, I could have misinterpreted the sound of the heater, or my own stressed breathing. I drove home carefully, through the snowy streets, the rational explanations becoming more convincing with each passing mile. By the time I arrived at my apartment, I had almost fully dismissed the incident as an anxiety-induced overreaction. That night, however, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I found myself replaying one detail that refused to be rationalized away. How had something tapped on my car from different locations without leaving footprints in the undisturbed snow? Since that night, I've changed my habits. I no longer take breaks in my car, preferring the fluorescent lit break room with its uncomfortable chairs and chatty coworkers. When closing shifts end, I ask a colleague to walk with me to the parking lot, inventing excuses about a recent car break-in nearby. Most significantly, I've developed a ritual before entering my vehicle. I always check the back seat first, opening the door and thoroughly inspecting the space before sitting down. I know it makes me look paranoid to anyone watching, but the alternative, experiencing that slow, deliberate breath behind me again, is unthinkable. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, when I'm driving home alone, I find myself checking the rearview mirror more frequently than necessary, half expecting to see those reflective eyes staring back at me from the shadows of the back seat. And whenever I hear an unexplained tap or knock, whether in my car or my apartment, my blood runs cold, because now I know that not everything that makes such sounds leaves evidence of its presence. Whatever was in that parking lot with me that snowy December night, whether it was something supernatural or simply a manifestation of my overworked mind, it stole something from me. The comfort of solitude, the safety of enclosed spaces, and the certainty that I am always alone when I believe myself to be.
The Goblin of Camp Pendleton. He enlisted in the Marine Corps straight out of high school, looking for discipline, purpose, and a path forward that didn't involve college debt or dead-end jobs in my small hometown. When I got stationed in California, friends back home congratulated me on my lucky assignment, imagining beaches and sunshine. What they didn't realize is that much of our training takes place in remote, inhospitable terrain, barren hilltops, sun-scorched valleys, and rock-strewn deserts, where the only living things appear to be the scorpions and the occasional scrub brush clinging stubbornly to life. These training grounds feel ancient and forgotten, places where humans are merely temporary visitors in landscapes that have witnessed millennia. My unit spent considerable time rotating between different field exercises across the state. Some were near Camp Pendleton proper, while others took us to more isolated training areas that felt disconnected from civilization, places where the night sky revealed stars you never see near cities, and where the silence after sunset becomes so absolute you can hear your own heartbeat. This story takes place about 18 months into my service, during a series of extended field exercises focusing on night operations, land navigation, and survival skills. From my first week at Pendleton, I heard whispered references to something called the Goblin. Initially, I assumed it was typical military folklore. Every base has its ghost stories and legends. Some Marines claimed it stole unattended gear. Others said they'd glimpsed something small and fast-moving through the underbrush during night watches. Most treated it as a joke, but there was an undercurrent of genuine belief that made me take notice. The Goblin got Rodriguez's canteen last night, someone would say at breakfast, and Rodriguez would nod grimly instead of denying it. Don't wander off alone, or the Goblin might follow you back to the barracks, a squad leader warned new arrivals, only half joking. What struck me as odd was that nobody called it a coyote, a fox, or any identifiable desert creature. Those who claimed to have seen it insisted it wasn't an animal they recognized, though the descriptions varied. Some said it walked on two legs, others claimed it moved on all fours, but in an unnatural jerking motion. Everyone agreed it was small, fast, and seemed to display a predatory intelligence beyond that of local wildlife. My first unusual experience occurred during an evening patrol exercise. We were following a ridgeline trail at dusk, preparing to set up observation posts for the night. My pack was heavier than usual, loaded with extra radio batteries and communication equipment, which occasionally left me lagging slightly behind the main group. We stopped to rest at a point where the trail widened. The sun had just disappeared behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. I was drinking from my canteen when I caught movement from the corner of my eye. Turning, I spotted something small darting between two large boulders, about 20 yards away. My initial impression was of a desert hare, or perhaps a fox, but there was something off about its movement, too erect, too deliberate. I nudged my buddy Nichols, pointing toward the rocks. "See that?" By the time he looked, whatever it was had vanished. He shrugged, grinning. "Probably just the goblin man." The others in earshot chuckled, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. For the briefest moment, I could have sworn the figure had been bipedal, standing upright, before ducking out of sight. But desert light plays tricks, especially at twilight, and I convinced myself I'd been mistaken. Over the next few weeks, mysterious incidents accumulated around our exercises. Marines reported missing items from their packs, energy bars, batteries, even personal mementos, like photos, or good luck charms. Packs left outside tents overnight often showed signs of tampering, with zippers opened and contents rearranged. While raccoons or coyotes might explain some of these occurrences, they couldn't account for the precision of the intrusions, or the selective nature of what went missing. A raccoon would scatter items carelessly. Whatever was taking our gear was deliberate, careful, and seemed to prefer specific objects, rather than just food. My second significant encounter happened during a night land navigation exercise. Each squad had split into pairs, with each duo responsible for locating specific coordinates, using only a map, compass, and the stars. Nichols and I were working well together, having found 3 of our 5 designated points. It was approximately 0200 hours, with a nearly full moon providing surprisingly good visibility across the open terrain. The night was cool and still, with no cloud cover and minimal wind, perfect conditions for navigation. We had just located one of our markers, a small reflective stake, driven into the ground at the precise coordinates we needed to find, and were consulting our map to determine the bearing to our next objective. Nichols suddenly tensed beside me, his hand gripping my forearm. "Look," he whispered, nodding to our left. About 40 feet away, partially concealed behind a stunted Joshua tree, was a small figure in a crouching position. In the moonlight, I could make out a distinctly humanoid shape, but with proportions that seemed wrong, limbs too thin, head too large for its body. We froze, instinctively understanding that any sudden movement might startle whatever we were observing. The figure remained perfectly still, but I could feel its attention fixed on us. The weak moonlight caught its eyes, 2 reflective points that gleamed with an unnatural orange-red tint, like copper catching firelight. Nichols shifted his weight slightly, reaching for the flashlight on his belt. At this minimal movement, the creature bolted, not on all 4s like an animal, but upright, on 2 legs, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. It zigzagged between rocks and scrub brush, its path erratic yet purposeful, until it disappeared beyond a distant ridge. "What, hell?" Nichols exhaled slowly, his hand still hovering over his flashlight. "That was definitely not a coyote," I agreed, my mouth dry. "Did you see how fast it moved?" His voice had an edge of awe mixed with the fear. "Nothing moves like that out here." We completed our exercise in tense silence, both hyper-aware of our surroundings. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustle of brush caused us to turn sharply. When we returned to the rendezvous point, at 0400, we debated whether to report what we'd seen. In the end, we simply marked the sighting on our map, with a small G for goblin, half joking but also acknowledging that we'd experienced something neither of us could explain. When we told a few trusted squad members, their reactions ranged from excited curiosity to dismissive jokes about dehydration and sleep deprivation. But I noticed that even the skeptics asked detailed questions. How tall was it exactly? Did it make any sounds? Were there any distinctive features besides the eyes? Their curiosity betrayed their own unacknowledged belief that something unusual stalked these training grounds. 2 weeks later came the encounter that eliminated
any remaining doubt from my mind. My squad was deployed on an extended field exercise, 5 nights in remote terrain, conducting simulated reconnaissance and surveillance operations. We carried standard equipment, tents, sleeping bags, MREs, water, first aid supplies, and communications gear. During the day we practiced movement techniques, observation skills, and tactical reporting. At night we established a perimeter, with 2-person watch shifts, rotating throughout the dark hours. The environment was challenging: cold desert nights, limited water, and the constant awareness that we were being evaluated on our performance. By the 5th night, fatigue had set in. We were functioning on minimal sleep, conserving water and energy, and counting the hours until extraction the following morning. Our camp was arranged in a rough circle, with 2-person tents spaced evenly around a central area, where we conducted planning and briefings. I shared a tent with Nichols, while Watson and Rivera occupied the tent adjacent to ours. The night was unusually still and cold, the temperature having dropped significantly after sunset. We had no fire, as it would compromise our position in a real-world scenario. So darkness enveloped our sight completely, except for the occasional use of red-filtered flashlights during watch changes. I awoke around 0100 to the sound of something moving outside our tent. At first I assumed it was the Marines on watch making rounds, or perhaps someone visiting the designated latrine area. But as I listened more attentively, the sounds didn't match human movement patterns. There was a delicate scratching against the tent fabric, methodical and precise, as if something was systematically examining the material. Nichols was asleep beside me, his breathing deep and regular. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears to track the movement outside. The scratching paused, then resumed on a different section of the tent, closer to my head now. It was followed by a light pressure against the fabric, causing the tent wall to bulge inward slightly. The impression wasn't that of a hand or paw, but a more amorphous shape, pressing with deliberate force. My heart rate accelerated, mouth going dry, as I slowly reached for my flashlight. The slight movement caused my sleeping bag to rustle, and immediately, the pressure on the tent disappeared. Nichols stirred beside me, blinking in confusion. I raised a finger to my lips, pointing toward the spot where the tent had been pressed inward. His eyes widened in understanding. We heard rapid, light footsteps circling the tent, then moving away. Nichols grabbed his rifle, loaded with blanks for the exercise, and we both scrambled for the tent entrance. Emerging into the frigid night air, we swept our flashlight beams across the campsite. My light caught something scurrying behind Watson and Rivera's tent, a small, thin figure, moving with that same unnatural speed I'd witnessed during the navigation exercise. For a fraction of a second, the creature paused, turning to look directly at us. The flashlight illuminated its face, or what passed for a face. It had a vaguely humanoid structure, but with exaggerated features that seemed almost caricature-like, overly large. Sunken eye sockets, housing those reflective copper-orange orbs. A lipless mouth, stretched too wide across a pointed chin. Skin that appeared leathery and grayish in the artificial light. It emitted a sound, a high-pitched hiss that carried a distinctly threatening quality, before darting away with that same impossible speed, disappearing over a small rise in the terrain. Watson and Rivera were already emerging from their tent, awakened by the commotion. "What the hell was that?" Watson demanded, his own flashlight beam sweeping erratically across the darkness. By this point, other Marines were awakening, creating a growing circle of confusion and alarm. 4 of us who had seen the creature began a cautious survey of the immediate area, while the others secured the camp perimeter.
What we found was disturbing in its concrete evidence. A clear set of footprints marked the ground around our tents, small, distinctly humanoid prints, roughly the size of a child's foot, but with an unusual arrangement of toes and a depth that suggested significant weight for their size. The tracks led to our food storage area, where several MREs had been disturbed. One was missing entirely. while others had been opened and specific components removed, primarily the desserts and the chemical heaters. The footprints continued to a rocky outcropping about 50 yards from our camp before disappearing among the boulders. None of us were eager to pursue the trail into those shadows. We retreated to camp, establishing a tighter perimeter and doubling the watch rotation for the remainder of the night. Few of us managed to sleep again. Every sound from the surrounding desert sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through our systems. Dawn brought blessed relief, golden sunlight spilling across the landscape, chasing away shadows and with them, some of our dread. In daylight we conducted a more thorough examination of the area. The footprints remained clearly visible, confirming that our night encounter hadn't been a mass hallucination. We also discovered small caches of items taken from previous camps, MRE components, a missing watch, even a dog tag that had been reported lost 2 weeks earlier, tucked into crevices in the rocks where the footprints disappeared. When we regrouped with our staff sergeant to report the incident, his reaction was telling. Rather than dismissing our account, he nodded grimly. "So you boys met the goblin, huh?" The way he said it, resigned yet knowing, suggested he'd heard similar reports many times before. "Is it some kind of animal, Sergeant?" Rivera asked, clearly hoping for a rational explanation. "Not like any animal I've ever seen," came the cryptic reply. "And I've been running exercises in these hills for 12 years. He didn't elaborate further, but instructed us to report any future sightings through the chain of command, rather than discussing them widely. That afternoon, we were extracted as scheduled and returned to base. Word of our encounter spread quickly through the company, spawning endless questions and theories. Most senior Marines treated it as an open secret, something acknowledged but not officially discussed. I began researching local folklore in my free time, discovering fragmented references to little people in the traditions of indigenous tribes who had once inhabited the area. These beings were described as mischievous and potentially dangerous, known for stealing from human camps and occasionally leading travelers astray. Some accounts described them as guardians of the land who resented human intrusion. Others portrayed them as more neutral entities, simply curious about human activities. Most enlightening were conversations with longer-serving Marines, particularly those who had participated in night exercises extensively. Almost all had stories, their own or second-hand, about equipment disappearing, strange tracks found around camps, or glimpses of small, fast-moving figures in the darkness. The consistency of these accounts across different units and time periods was striking. In the months that followed, I experienced 2 more brief sightings during field exercises, fleeting glimpses of that same gaunt silhouette moving at the periphery of our camps. Each time, items would go missing overnight, primarily food and small personal objects. Some Marines took to leaving offerings, an extra MRE component, or a shiny trinket, at the edge of the camp, claiming it prevented more valuable gear from being taken. Others reinforced their shelters with various protections, from religious symbols to elaborate arrangements of stones. Whether these measures truly deterred the entity, or merely provided psychological comfort, remained unclear. What was evident was that the goblin had become integrated into the unofficial culture of the base, simultaneously treated as joke, legend, and genuine phenomenon. I've since completed my service and moved on to civilian life, but the memories of those encounters in the California desert remain vivid and disturbing. I've spoken with wildlife experts and anthropologists, seeking rational explanations for what we experienced. Some suggest an undocumented species, adapted to the harsh desert environment. Others propose psychological effects, induced by stress, sleep deprivation, and the power of suggestion in an isolated group setting. Yet none of these explanations fully account for what dozens of trained observers have reported consistently over many years: a small bipedal entity that moves with impossible speed, displays apparent intelligence, and interacts with human camps in ways that suggest more than mere animal behavior. Whatever patrols those remote training grounds at Camp Pendleton, whether an unknown creature, a manifestation of collective belief, or something that defies our current understanding of reality, continues to make its presence known to new generations of Marines. The goblin has become part of the shared experience that binds service members together, a common encounter with something beyond normal explanation. So if you ever find yourself in those desolate training areas as darkness falls, secure your gear carefully, and perhaps leave a small offering at the perimeter of your camp. Because when the desert night grows still, and the shadows deepen between the rocks, you may hear the soft scratching of small feet circling your position, the goblin making its rounds, assessing what might be worth taking from these temporary human visitors to its ancient territory. That brings us to the end of this Tales from the Break Room episode. Before I go, riddle me this. If you figured out that a goblin was messing with your house and your things, what would you do? Would you set up some goblin traps? Would you stay up all night, ready to teach it a lesson? Let me know your style of retribution in the comments. I'll see you again real soon. Be sure to send me your scary work stories at iracast.com/submit. Follow and review Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, so we can reach as many new fans as possible. And sign up for members-only content at iracast.com/plus to support us. Thank you. Now then, I've got to clock out. But don't worry, I'll be back soon for yet another late night shift.